Welcome to the Retail Focus Podcast, a weekly collection of news, interviews, and information from the world of retail. Here are your hosts, Trent Kling and Leighton Kling.
Welcome to this week's Retail Focus Podcast with Trent Kling and Leighton Kling. Coming up, lots to discuss today, including more news regarding Sears being dangerously close to bankruptcy, apparently. We've got a C-Store data report to tell you about from Koupon Insights. We'll discuss Walgreens Boots Alliance earnings, and we'll close out the show by talking about our neighbors to the north in Canada and how Walmart may be looking back to Canada to spur on growth. We're brought to you this week by AdRoll.com, which helps ambitious brands orchestrate social ads, email, and other marketing channels to drum up more revenue. Also, we're brought to you by Blinkist, an app that distills the key insights of 2,500 plus best-selling nonfiction books into powerful 15-minute reads or listens. As always, a reminder to please rate us or like us wherever you do access our podcast. So let's get going. We begin with Sears. You know, oftentimes, Leighton, we haven't discussed Sears all that much on the podcast simply because it seems like we hear about these stories of store closures and Sears financial failings over and over again. At this point, it just seems like clickbait. But this week, we got substantial word that Sears could be close to bankruptcy or filing for bankruptcy. It was said as soon as this weekend, so we put off recording the podcast until this weekend. So far, nothing coming down on the Sears front, but we do know as of Friday, people familiar with the matter said that it is an inevitability that they will file bankruptcy, but that the plan is to keep the company going in at least some capacity.
Sears, together with Kmart, has about 700 stores remaining in the U.S. Pretty much, if you look at the split between Sears and Kmart, it's a 55-45 split, meaning that 55% of the stores are Sears, 45% being Kmart. Kmart just having a little over 300 stores. If we were to take a personal preference on this podcast, we would prefer Kmart. We think that the Sears merger several years ago, or over a dozen years ago, actually hurt the Kmart brand. And as a result, don't see a lot of reinvestment into the Kmart brand. And we'll get into that as we look through over the recent years and the missteps that management has made. Eddie Lampert, Sears' largest shareholder and CEO, could be putting together a stalking horse bid for the remaining assets. And we find this pretty hilarious because over the years, Lampert and his hedge fund ESL Investments have actually spun off a number of brands already that he has majority stakes in, and assets have been sold off to create value for the company. Sears Holdings obviously looking to create short-term liquidity to make sure that their employees are getting their paychecks, to make sure that vendors are getting their payments. ESL has also pocketed hundreds of millions, by the way, in interest from Sears with these multiple loans. So as Eddie, through ESL Investments, has loaned Sears Holdings operational cash, they get interest off of that. So that interest expense, that very expense that has caused a lot of the short-term and mid-term liquidity problems for Sears, has resulted in a beneficial boost in the interest expense for ESL Investments, as many of those shareholders, by the way, in ESL Investments, a long-term hedge fund, have decided to not deal with the hedge fund anymore because of Lampert's decision-making. But Land's End, Sears Canada, Sears Hometown, and of course the REIT, Seritage Growth Properties, that we've talked about one or two times on this podcast during their earnings reports, all saw Lampert take majority ownership stakes. Sears Canada has obviously since liquidated, but Lampert actually did get a $25 million last dividend once they closed their doors as well. So I say all of that to say this: over the last 3 years on the podcast, we have covered each major slew of closings. As Trent alluded to, we don't cover them every single time they are in the news because over the last 10 or 12 months or so, they have been in the news quite a bit. But you look now, the company has decided to close even their most profitable stores recently as distribution has ran thin. So operationally, they've made all of these horrible decisions, and now they're actually having to close stores that do well for their overall portfolio. Lampert, for the last 14 years, has resisted this reinvestment. When Sears and Canada actually merged, they had plenty of cash flow to remodel stores and refresh their brand. They had millions in positive operational cash. People forget that. Sears and Kmart, they weren't doing too bad 15, 16 years ago. They had over 3,500 stores together. Instead, management opted to be more efficient, to cut costs. they looked at this as more of an investment, more of a passive investment, not an active investment, thinking that this operational cash will just keep coming for years to come, and then they can actually boost it by cutting costs, by either laying off or firing employees, not addressing the immediate maintenance requests for the individual stores. This has led, Trent, to a stale store presence throughout the United States. And to be honest, it really bums us out because we're retail fans and we grew up, again, with Kmart and Sears. Now these staple retailers are going downhill in a very fast pace. And you look at during the Great Recession, management of Sears Holdings actually had the option of opting out of several store leases in underperforming stores because there was a lot going on with banks at the time. They could have actually opted out and not re-signed or renegotiated a lease. Yet with these underperforming stores, Lampert was actually bullish on re-signing. And this is actually per some of the top executives that were working under Lampert at that time. So just missteps everywhere. If you look at the timeline from about 12, 13 years ago to now, you really understand why they are in the situation they are in. And with this latest news, Lampert would actually stand to be paid via ESL investments because of the debt holding priority. Yes, he has a nearly 50% equity stake in Sears Holdings, but if the shares go to zero, Trent, the liquidation sales would actually funnel down to the lending arm of his business, which is ESL Investments. However, the plan now seems to keep at least 300 stores open immediately and close 150. So I speak of liquidation sales, but it does not seem to be the path that they at least want in the near term. Sears is looking to short-term financing to stay open through the holidays, which would be, in our opinion, good for everybody involved. If they could stave off closing most of their remaining store base, they could benefit suppliers and vendors because they're getting paid. They're helping the overall economy while also being able to mark down and move out some more stagnant inventory. Think about this. More customers are coming into Kmart and Sears during the holiday season. Whether or not it's because of the specialized seasonal inventory, they're still coming in. They're coming in at higher levels. So why can't you just move out that stagnant inventory that, in theory, you would have to move out anyway if you were going to fully liquidate? In addition, the company still employs around 89,000 workers, and this would get them roughly into 2019 without having to actually mentally prepare for the stores to be liquidated immediately. This would help the workers get those extra paychecks during the holiday season. You always hate to see retail store closures towards the end of the year because of the holidays. And again, this would help mentally prepare them into 2019 and to say, maybe I should start looking for another job because Sears, they might not be around too much longer. But in the midterm, at least, if Sears does close 150 stores and keeps 300 stores, that leaves around 250 in flux. The idea here being that the remaining 250 stores could be saved if they're able to renegotiate leases during the bankruptcy.
So all of that Leighton just talked about, we need to once again put that in perspective because the key here is one of the biggest things that was mentioned is the liquidation sales would ultimately funnel down to the lending arm, which is ESL Investments. And Leighton talked about all the missteps over the last 12 years. All of the aspects of the stores kind of falling apart, not reinvesting in the stores, not even putting additional lights in the stores when a light bulb burns out. But you kind of wonder if these missteps, just simply because of that lending from ESL Investments, if some of them haven't been intentional. I think that's what a lot of analysts are kind of wondering about regarding Sears overall, is it seems like Eddie Lampert's too smart of a guy ultimately, and a guy that's made a ton of money in his career as a hedge fund manager, to not know what he's doing in this circumstance. So you wonder if at this point, they're kind of just intentionally neglecting the brand, knowing that they're going to get whatever money that comes from the liquidation. Doesn't necessarily seem to make sense to us on the surface. And Leighton talked about the fact that, we don't want to see Sears and Kmart fail, certainly. Longtime listeners might know this, but my first retail job was at a Kmart. One of Leighton's first retail jobs was actually at a Sears. So between the two of us, we've worked at both outlets that Sears Holdings controls, and it is difficult for us to see any retailers go underneath, and we're not rooting for it. But again, in this circumstance, it's appeared as though it's an inevitability for the last 2 years. And honestly, We're surprised that it hasn't come to this sooner. Now, analysts have pointed to the lack of cash on hand to pay employees and buy inventory for the holidays, which is a valid point, certainly, considering the $134 million debt payment that is due supposedly on Monday the 15th. They had $193 million left on the balance sheet back in August and almost $269 million available from lenders. This, however, has most likely dwindled down through the last 2 months of operations. And so this is why you're hearing a lot of this scuttlebutt regarding a potential bankruptcy as soon as this weekend or potentially next week. Now, what's troublesome is that Reuters reported that 3 major vendors have reported missed payments from Sears. This is usually a fairly good sign that bankruptcy is right around the corner. When vendors start missing payments from Sears, it would be hard for any vendor then going into the holiday season to have confidence with Sears, and that is crucial. We talk about bankruptcies that have happened in retail in the past, and you look at just the constant trend of vendors not being confident in a retailer to pay them back. It happened with Toys R Us. It happened in the early 90s with Children's Palace. It's happened ultimately with a lot of different retailers, and it almost always means it's a death knell for that retailer. If your vendor won't work with you, then you can't stock the shelves for the holiday season. It means your holiday sales would be down even more than expected, and eventually it's a cycle that turns onto itself. So all of that Leighton said about staying open through the holidays would certainly make sense if you're essentially using the holidays to liquidate your merchandise. But if you're actually looking to increase holiday sales, if vendors won't work with you, you are in trouble. And Sears, according to multiple outlets, is trying to negotiate different forms of financing, including debtor in possession financing. However, current lenders are pushing for immediate liquidation, so this leaves it up in the air if stores will remain open through bankruptcy, let alone through 2019, because all of these lenders are basically pushing for liquidation. They want their money now. They don't want to renegotiate on the debt because they have a lack of confidence as far as Sears' future. But the largest concern going forward for us is basically the plans to keep any number of stores relevant. We feel like the brands might still work, even though some analysts say the brands are essentially worthless. But the key is if they can remain at least halfway relevant through this process, they may have potential future to them. But again, it's all going to come down to what the bankruptcy courts say if they do file for bankruptcy. And while this was all going on, by the way, we should mention that yesterday it came out that District 300 in Illinois has now sued Sears Holdings because, long story short, they are providing fewer than the 4,250 jobs required by an economic development agreement for their Hoffman Estates headquarters. The idea here is that Sears, a few years ago, opted for an extension of some tax benefits that they're getting at the expense, at least District 300 contends, of the school district. And so, because they fell beneath this floor, there's this lawsuit going on, and so Sears now has to deal with this in addition to dealing with a potential bankruptcy coming up, simply because they haven't been able to uphold their end of the bargain with the tax breaks they're getting at that Hoffman Estates headquarters.
A lot on the plate of Sears' management. And Trent, you make a great point, though, because if they were to stay open, at least in some form or fashion, over the next year or two, let's say with a limited number of stores remaining, most Kmart stores right now have not been taken care of. The very basic qualities of retail, such as adequate lighting, clean floors, and fuller shelves, those qualities have not been met. And in my experience, at least here recently, after having visited a store in Costa Mesa, a Kmart store does exist in Costa Mesa, by the way. I was actually visiting Newport Beach for an interview that I had recently, but my experience was terrible. I went into that store after the interview, and honestly, the store was not taken care of at all. It was actually one of the worst Kmarts I have been to in some time. And when Trent and I were at shop.org last year in September in LA, we visited 2 Kmart stores, and this Costa Mesa location was actually worse than both of those. So this really puts it in perspective as to how they are going and how they are operating. And the main question here is, if they were to keep, again, a percentage of their store base open, what are they going to do to make it worth their while, worth the while of the customers coming into the stores? Because if you're going to maintain the same level of quality you have now going forward for the next 2, 3, 4 years, it's still not going to be a good ending to this story. So even in 2005, when the company had over 3,000 stores, like I had previously mentioned, they needed to address the very same issue. So their track record is lacking. And so it's really just a matter of time before we see, in our opinion, the majority of the locations shut down. Sears Holdings, by the way, in terms of stock price, ticker SHLD, is, of course, at an all-time low, as you would expect. Shares were down over 40% this week on this news, which sounds like a lot, except for the fact they're down nearly 90% year to date. Sears now has a market cap just around $44 million.
And to piggyback on your point, you were talking about visiting the store in Costa Mesa. I recently went to one of the few remaining Kmart stores in Colorado, one in Pueblo, Colorado. It's actually fairly busy, and the soft lines in particular were well taken care of, but the seasonal section was in complete disarray. They had Halloween merchandise mixed in with Christmas merchandise, and the garden center, even though it was open to the public, was more like a construction zone. Very few actual pieces of merchandise out in the garden center for purchase. But to that point, I can confirm that a lot of Kmart stores are now receiving that seasonal merchandise, and if they're looking to close down immediately, then the question becomes, what happens to that Christmas seasonal merchandise that the stores already have here in mid-October and are already setting out on the shelves? So a lot to be decided as far as Sears Holdings is concerned going forward. And again, we're particularly interested in these two brands. Can the two brands survive a potential bankruptcy? And will a potential bidder show up for one or both of their major store brands, if not one of their appliance brands? Now, we talked about the numbers for Sears not looking so good, but here's a number that is rather impressive. 88% of financially successful people read at least 30 minutes per day. Look, financially successful people are hungry for knowledge. They continuously seek self-improvement and learning every chance they get, even if that chance is only about 15 minutes long, and Blinkist gets you there faster than you can imagine. Look, I am one of those people that has a very tight schedule typically. That's why sometimes we have problems uploading the podcast at a certain day every single week. And the list of books that I want to read or that people have suggested that I read is never ending and always expanding. I don't have time to read them all though, but our sponsor Blinkist has solved the long list of must-reads once and for all.
Blinkist is the only app that takes thousands of best-selling nonfiction books and distills them down to their most powerful, impactful moments so you can read them or listen to them in under 15 minutes, all on your phone, all on your smartphone. And we all know we have a smartphone, so there's no excuse. And with Blinkist, you will expand your knowledge and learn more just in that 15-minute time span than you can in almost any other way. Plus, you can listen anywhere. I like to listen to Blinkist while I'm at work because my job is rather mindless. Also, the Blinkist library is massive, from timeless classics like Freakonomics to the current Amazon bestsellers such as Getting Things Done. So a lot of motivational material out there, and Blinkist is the perfect option for me. My personal recommendation too, by the way, is to check out the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I believe that anybody who's into personal development can really gain a lot by listening to that.
I enjoy the 80-20 principle also on Blinkist as well. I've got about a 30-minute commute to work. Blinkist, a lifesaver for that. And right now, for a limited time, Blinkist has a special offer just for our Retail Focus podcast audience. Go to Blinkist.com/retail to start your free 7-day trial. That's Blinkist, spelled Blinkist, Blinkist.com/retail to start your free 7-day trial. You can cancel at any time. That's Blinkist.com/retail. Well, Koupon Insights released their annual C-Store data report. By the way, that's Coupon with a K, and it is full of interesting information about a C-Store industry that we don't often detail on the podcast, except for sometimes acquisitions or entries into new markets. One of the first sections of this report, and again, a yearly data report, looks at how sales are broken down on an hourly basis. And this was perhaps what we found most interesting. They broke things down into the categories of alcohol, beverage, like fountain drinks, for example, or pre-bottled drinks, food, candy, snack, and tobacco. Now, food is a priority more in the morning time, wanes as the day goes on. That's what Koupon Insights has found. They've also found that alcohol demand grows throughout the day and peaks in the afternoon, whereas tobacco sales, interestingly enough, stay steady for the entire day at C-stores. And this is interesting. Caffeine-infused beverages are sold most on Wednesdays, making the lagging effects of hump day an apparent real thing for most Americans. But what this study tells us, too, is that convenience store operators may need to focus their marketing efforts on the different times of day going forward. We know that a lot of convenience stores are jumping into commercials on either radio or TV, some even jumping into online commercials or Spotify commercials, that type of thing. And sometimes we see it borne out where the focus on breakfast sandwiches will take place early in the day, ready-made items at lunch. But this is suggesting, and some of this research suggests, that even on marketing going beyond that, detailing some specific other categories may be beneficial during day parts.
The busiest days of the week are what you might have expected in this space. Sales on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, so more towards the weekend, are all above average, and significantly above average, actually. If you look at the graph that they were able to provide and you look at why sales are the greatest here, well, a lot of people are going out. You speak of nightlife on Fridays and Saturdays. They visit convenience stores more often. The highest sales day, you might ask, Friday is actually the highest one, and top Saturday for bringing in the most people, and by a wide margin too, which actually surprised me. I figured that Friday and Saturday seemed to be sort of the same, at least anecdotally. Sundays are actually the slowest, again, taking me by surprise. Roughly 60% actually of the foot traffic that you would see on a normal Tuesday. But what's interesting here is that newspaper consumption is actually the highest on Sunday. So while people may not be going in to grab a cup of coffee or some snacks, they are grabbing their Sunday newspaper. And breaking down sales by season, we can actually see that some categories thrive only during certain parts of the year. For instance, one in the summertime. 50% of ice consumption happens only in those 3 months. So in the summer months, and 40% of beverages like slushies make up a total year's worth of sales during, again, that 3-month span in the summertime. The wintertime sees an increase in car-related sales, as you would expect, like washer fluid and wiper blades for your automobile, but also fuel additives and oil, items that are really tied into the areas of the year that see the most damage done to cars. You think of AutoZone or O'Reilly Auto Parts, those types of retailers that we've covered on the podcast. They often talk about how weather totally affects their business and how they're able to actually look at weather forecasts in order to predict how they should be buying their goods. And what we are not surprised by is actually seeing a steady stream of alcohol sales and tobacco sales throughout the year. So we're talking about seasons here. That does not change a whole lot. In the winter months, alcohol sales are high. In the summer months, alcohol sales are high, as well as spring and fall. One outlier there being that e-cigarettes are actually sold more, or at least e-cigarette materials are sold more during the spring season. I wonder why that is. They did not list a reason for that. However, alcohol and tobacco sales do dip right after the new year, as do candy bar sales, according to this study, as people have found that New Year's resolutions fresh in their mind really affect what they tend to buy immediately after the new year. But beverage and food sales too show more than a 15% dip versus the average in January and February. Coupon Offer Site brings this data to light in order to promote their own machine learning platform, which can actually help convenience stores better identify not only what products to sell and when to sell them, but what products go together when they do sell them.
So an example they give in the study is that Dr. Pepper and Reese's products are 2.5 times more likely to be purchased together. So in that circumstance, it's kind of one brand leading into another. Ruffles and Snapple, also 3 times more likely to be purchased together. And this was probably my second favorite takeaway outside of the seasonality and the day parts of when things are sold, because here the takeaway is not only how to better market these type of complementary offerings, going above and beyond just brands, but also how to merchandise the commonly bought together items in the store in order to boost top line sales. And there's a lot of data out there. Sometimes the sheer amount can be overwhelming, but it's important to at least attempt to make sense of some of these larger industry insights. Some of the insights that they gave forward that I found interesting was the fact that cigarettes basically had a positive correlation with nearly everything except for snack bars in the convenience store. Strongest correlation actually with beer, bottled soda, and energy drinks. Some correlations make perfect sense. For example, the donut's strongest correlation is with coffee, people getting that donut and coffee in the morning. Fountain soda's strongest correlation is with the roller grill or the chips, something salty to go with something sweet. But I found this particularly interesting in that chocolate bars, the strongest correlation with chocolate bars are actually chips. So once again, people wanting that sweet and salty, but those are two items that you don't very frequently see cross-marketed together, and that might be something that you'll see convenience stores potentially doing in the future with this data. A lot of it, again, makes sense. It makes sense in your mind, but the fact that the chocolate bar's strongest correlation in a convenience store is not bottled water, it's not fountain soda, it's not coffee, it's not beer, it's not anything else, it is chips. That is really quite remarkable because, again, you don't see those two things offered together very often. Now, throughout this study, they do look at areas of correlation that we feel might have less emphasis placed on it going forward than the ones that we've already touched on. For example, the brand-to-brand correlation. One of the things that they mentioned in the study is they correlate sales of some subcategories like chips and ice cream, for example, with the overall health of the stock market, believe it or not. They look at how many more bags of chips are sold when the S&P 500 does well, but because you can't control, if you're a convenience store, you can't control what the market does or how consumers may feel on a macroeconomic basis, it's kind of foolish to predict future sales based on predictions of consumer sentiment. For example, just looking at Yahoo Finance and seeing that the Dow is up on a given day and trying to push chips to consumers probably won't work because, again, it's the overall consumer sentiment that's going to drive those sales up in the end. So not a lot of data there as far as what businesses can do to cross-market things when the stock market's doing well. But that's what I found very valuable about this is some of those correlations that might be floating underneath the surface that are not common knowledge. And honestly, a lot of convenience stores aren't taking full advantage of the cross-marketing available according to this study.
In order to run a successful business, it may be best for convenience stores to stick to making customers happy and going with the data insights that are more consistent, those insights that they know, those trends that they are aware of. As an example, we know that the seasons are still going to exist for the long term and that the basic outline of an American work week is still going to stay the same. So people usually work Monday through Friday, and so the general trends, the general traffic trends, and what consumers are going to want. Trent mentioned coffee on Wednesdays or caffeine-infused beverages on Wednesdays. Those data points should be given more credence. This, by the way, is not to say that stores should not pay attention to their local demographics. There are profound trends with the types of different beverages, in fact, different income brackets consume. Fountain coffee is more widely popular in areas with wealthy individuals and higher income families, whereas fountain soda is more popular on the opposite end of the income spectrum. So they do mention that it is extremely important to pay attention to those local demographics. However, again, this ties into the idea that you know your business more than anybody else. So pay attention to the data that you have for your relative locations. And also, don't pay attention to the macro picture. It's very important to stay focused in what you're doing and what you're best at and how you can differentiate to increase your customer base.
I come downstairs and I overhear my mum and dad talking in our native Farsi that, potentially we might lose our last shop, and we've always had stores growing up. I guess I was just in my own little bubble enjoying my job in music, and I didn't really realize that potentially our house was on the line. We both knew something had to change. I genuinely firmly believed in the digital process, in getting our garments seen online. I knew we needed help, and I knew we needed a platform to help get our content seen and our message heard. The first campaign that we engaged with AdRoll returned 27 times the ROI. I can turn back and say to Dad, look what we've accomplished.
To learn more about how Nav Salimian turned his family business into a global retail brand, visit adroll.com/retail. That's ADROLL.com/retail.
So one of the things we mentioned in our last story as we kick off the second half of the Retail Focus podcast is the fact that market fluctuations that are positive may result in more chips and candy bars and that type of thing being sold. Well, Market fluctuations generally not positive this week. A tough first 4 days of the market this last week up until an upturn on Friday. And amidst all that market turmoil, Walgreens Boots Alliance released earnings that actually exceeded analysts' expectations. They released their fourth quarter results on Thursday of this week. Shares fell by about 2%, but that's less of a margin than the Dow fell. Many blamed the drop on lagging sales growth, but we feel like the mix of profit beating and revenue missing would ordinarily leave this stock largely unchanged. They were likely dragged down a little bit just by other macro factors. Adjusted earnings per share for Walgreens came in at $1.48 versus the expected $1.45, and GAAP net income, get this, hit an astounding $1.5 billion. Compare that with the $802 million brought in during 2017's quarter four. And quite honestly, Walgreens surprised not only analysts, but us as well, as we're typically a little bit more bullish on CVS in this space. Some of the factors that led to this $1.5 billion on GAAP net income included the lower effective tax rate and the sales of Premise Health as well in July. Both of those helped the bottom line. Now let's talk top line.
Top line revenue for the retail pharmacy powerhouse came in over 10% better than last year, but the $33.44 billion in sales did not do enough to move the needle versus analyst expectations. Granted, they were only off by about 1% from this key figure that analysts were bringing to light. Let's remember that this quarter actually did include all of the sales from the acquired Rite Aid stores, so that year-over-year bump was bound to be in the double digits, regardless of how Walgreens' organic growth performed. Rite Aid, of course, being a company that we have talked about a lot on this podcast, having almost recently been taken private by Albertsons, or at least their remaining store portfolio, but that did not pan out. Meanwhile, Walgreens is actually busy trying to get the majority of the remaining Fred's Pharmacy locations that aren't already operated by a third-party operator. We should note that without acquisitions and divestments this quarter, Walgreens revenue actually still would have grown 3.2%. So we have to put it all in perspective and say, without the Rite Aid acquisition, without the divestment of Premise Health, where would their revenues be? They would still be in the green. So that's a very good thing for Walgreens and their management there to showcase to shareholders and analysts on the call. We all know by now that prescription sales are rising in the United States and that most established retail pharmacies stand to benefit the most because they have the most brand equity. The people have already been going to those retail pharmacy locations because they've been around for so long and perhaps they've had a prior script through them. The number one growth indicator for us being the percentage of revenue that comes from the pharmacy business. You look at the overall revenue pie for Walgreens, you really have to compare the retail sales to the pharmacy sales and see how are they performing? How are they performing relative to one another? Well, over the last couple of years, we've noticed a trend and we've talked about it on this podcast every single time we talk about a CVS or a Walgreens quarter. This quarter, pharmacy sales, Trent, 76.2% of overall revenue. In recent years, it was actually closer to 70%. If you go back 3, 4, 5 years ago, it was in the high 60s. So this really speaks to the level of pharmacy sales that they're bringing in. They brought in as a whole number, an aggregate number, $25.5 billion in prescription drug sales. That's a lot of prescription drugs. A deeper dive into the average American's prescription drug usage really spells out a picture that sees green for all those in the retail pharmacy space. A 2017 study found that 55% of Americans regularly take a prescription medicine, 85% more prescriptions filled now between 1997 and 2016. Just take that in for a bit because we're talking about billions of dollars more in prescription drugs. And who is to benefit besides the drug companies, besides the pharmacy benefit managers? It's going to be the retail pharmacies that are ushering you those drugs. So those who take a prescription drug also, they take 4 on average. So if you're already in the system, chances are long term, you're only going to be shopping at Walgreens or CVS more so. So there's been a major lack of oversight between different health providers and insurance companies too. And some studies are actually saying that more regulation in this industry over the pharmaceutical industry actually could be more of a risk detriment for retailers such as Walgreens, because a lot of people are getting prescriptions from different providers. Therefore, they don't know the side effect profile. And therefore, upon looking at their overall prescription base, they might reduce that in the long term. Regardless, Walgreens is ultimately the beneficiary of higher drug use. We have to look at the overall trend, and the overall trend says that more prescription drugs are going to be sold through 2035. So it's drug sales. They're growing by over 14%. Again, overall revenue grew by about 10 or 11%. So it's actually growing at a higher pace than their overall business. And Trent, on the call, CEO Stefano Pessina actually was particularly pleased about the cash generation brought in from this pharmaceutical business.
Yeah, and you mentioned Stefano Pessina talking not only about cash generation, but also margin growth throughout the business on this earnings call. He noted that being customer-focused will carry Walgreens overall a long way, and emphasizing this will garner them long-term market share. Now, he did mention that the healthcare market is, in their eyes, only going to continue to grow, and the Rite Aid acquisition has been executed on time and on budget. And sometimes we see circumstances where you acquire a brand or a piece of a brand or a series of retail stores, and you have difficulty folding those in. One thing that comes to mind is when Sycamore Partners bought a bunch of Family Dollar stores in order to make the Dollar Tree Family Dollar deal work. They had trouble executing a conversion to Dollar Express, and eventually many of those stores either went out of business or were sold off. That was an instance where it wasn't really executed on time and on budget, at least as far as Sycamore Partners was concerned. So in this case, very good to hear that from Walgreens, that so far the Rite Aid acquisition has been positive as it's met their goals internally for time and budgetary restrictions. Now, outside of acquisitions, management feels like strategic partnerships are also important in driving their knowledge of all facets of healthcare. We've seen this with Walgreens' major competitor in CVS, how their strategic partnerships have really vaulted CVS kind of to the next level. For Walgreens, selling, general, and administrative costs did improve slightly. This is the 21st straight quarter of SG&A improvement. That is an amazing number. It's one thing to have 21 straight quarters of growth in top-line revenue or sales, but SG&A improvement is tough to get a handle on for 21 consecutive quarters. And that number, by the way, is as a percentage of revenue. Now, speaking of costs, they're experiencing a bit of a squeeze on pharmaceuticals, something that's been talked a lot about in the mainstream media because of the new generics hitting the market. Even though Walgreens has pricing power, they're hamstrung in their pricing by competitors and by the series of generics that have recently been released and are out on the market. Retail margins, however, have been doing better. That's that front of store revenue that oftentimes we will dog Walgreens about either ignoring or not paying enough attention to that aspect of the store. So it's good to see retail margins in the front of the store doing better, and that's helped to offset some of the pharmacy erosion. You kind of wonder if going forward, leadership will pay even more attention to the front of the store, knowing that margins will be more robust there as more generics continue to hit the market for impactful drugs.
We mentioned the growth in the number of individuals on prescription drugs, or at least I mentioned it. And I'm going to go back to prescription drugs just for a little bit because we need to look at the quantity of drugs an average person in the U.S. takes. And it's easy to paint a picture for the large retail pharmacy players like Walgreens and CVS that shows a bright future because of the large numbers. But the reality is that this quarter, at least this fourth quarter for Walgreens, is that they are seeing increased business because of just that plain increased demand. The number of 30-day prescriptions, including immunizations, oddly enough, increased 11.8% in the quarter, just over 10.5% for the entire fiscal year. Changes in the Medicare Part D network have helped this out, but by and large, it was the aggregate of a number of factors. And going forward, they are going to see more insurers on board with the ACA and a number of states where some of the insurers have actually opted out. Total retail pharmacy comps were up, as you would expect from these type of growth numbers. Unclear, however, as to whether Rite Aid pharmacy comps were up, but they did play a fairly large role in the overall sales growth, of course. Walgreens now claims to have 22.3% of the U.S. retail pharmacy market share, and that is why I've said everything previously, is to say this: there is basically an oligopoly in the United States for retail pharmacies. 22.3% of an already entirely massive market for pharmaceuticals. It's just going to be an astounding figure in terms of aggregate sales if they can hold on to this over 20% figure. Moving on to retail, and this is something that Trent and I love to talk about despite what you've heard so far on this story with all of the pharmaceutical news. It was basically more of the same though for them. We are seeing increases in pricing from the retail segment, helping margins and total retail sales. but are increasing primarily due to having more stores. So sales are increasing, but that's because they have more stores in their portfolio. Retail comps were down 1.9%. And this is something we have to really pay attention to, because we say retail sales are up, and that could be misleading because those shareholders in the company see that all sales are up, pharmaceuticals and retail sales, but comps are down. And this means that they are still struggling in that particular category. And in the quarter, again, 1.9% drop, but 2.4% for the entire fiscal year. And for Walgreens, it is as though they have conceded the fact that retail interest is capped, but there's always going to be, at least in their eyes, maybe a portion of their consumer base that buys their retail goods when they come in to fill prescriptions. And so we think that it's actually a good explanation here of the pricing increases, because even the most modest pricing increases may not push away the customers. And honestly, you have to look at the loyalty of the customers. If you're going to get a steady stream of traffic regardless of your retail pricing, then why not push up the margins? Because you've already conceded the fact that you're only going to be able to sell a finite amount of goods in a Walgreens. So as far as promotion, they did let off the gas with tobacco and seasonal products, again, relating to the retail business. Management noted a direct impact on retail revenues because of that.
And this goes back to what I was referencing earlier in the story, the fact that margins are increasing here, whether you're increasing prices or not. The fact that margins are increasing might cause Walgreens to take a second look at their front of store sales, because you're right, Leighton, retail comps were down. That's not a good look, because this can be a high margin area and a potential area for development amongst their loyal customers. Sometimes it's not about getting those loyal customers to just buy from the front of the store, but the ones that are already buying at the front of the store, getting them to buy more. And that's one of the reasons why we talk about promotion here. And Leighton noted they let off the gas with tobacco products in particular. Of course, CVS stopped selling cigarettes years ago, a move many were worried about at the time, but one that has clearly worked in CVS's favor in terms of branding that health designation overall. CVS has kind of been out in front of a number of initiatives, and in terms of PR and in terms of overall image, that's why CVS is kind of winning this race against Walgreens. Leighton mentioned the state of the oligopoly, basically, in the retail pharmaceutical industry, and you're really down to just kind of the big two here. Interestingly enough, it was the health and wellness areas for Walgreens that saw positive categorical growth, and of course, beauty, which is a long-time staple for the company. One final note on retail as we dig through the retail numbers, it seems that the acquired Rite Aid store retail margins have actually gone in the opposite direction. They're excluded from listed retail gross margin figures. This will probably be an area of emphasis in the coming years going forward as they begin to acclimate those stores into their system. They'll probably adopt the same or similar product mix as those typical Walgreens stores. And long term, this will, of course, help those margins even more. If those newly acquired stores aren't coming in where those margins are for the rest of the Walgreens chain, if you push those Rite Aid stores up, that gives them some runway in theory, as they'll be buying a lot of the same product for the nearly 1,500 more stores in the domestic portfolio. And because their pricing will be more consistent overall, you're going to see those stores begin to see an uptick potentially in that margin. And of the acquired Rite Aid stores, they have closed 458, so quite a few stores there. That seems like a large number for us. And again, as we mentioned during the Kmart and Sears story, we hate to see any brick and mortar retail close, but this was in fact in their guidance. They knew that a certain number of those Rite Aid stores were too close to Walgreens stores to make things work. They're trying to avoid cannibalization, and it appears as though the finishing touches will actually be put on the acquisition over the next 10 months. We're curious to see how many lease obligations they've had to pay off the balance for those closed stores, and if it was truly a net positive in the long term to close as many of these locations so quickly. They have thrown out that big synergy number you often see after an acquisition like this. That synergy number now sits at $650 million per year, and that is $50 million greater than originally expected. So the benefits from the synergies may outdo the negatives from having to pay off all those lease obligations.
We switch gears in our final story from retail pharmacy to just massive big retail and Walmart, as they appear to be cycling back to Canada as a driver of growth. And almost All of our stories come from the US, but every now and then we cover a story north of the border that impacts our Canadian friends. Usually it's about one of my favorite stores. One of my favorite dollar store concepts in general is Dollarama, a massive powerhouse in Canada. But for this story, we're going to be honed in on the massive grocery investment that's going to be taking place for Walmart in Canada. And again, often gets ignored when we talk about the hyper-competitive grocery industry in the US, but it's for good reason. If you look at their landscape, Metro and the Northwest Company each own hundreds of different grocery stores throughout Canada with multiple different banners, but there are dozens of well-trafficked regional chains as well. And if you look at the overall amount of stores, and I was just looking at a list before having done the research, actually really getting into the nitty-gritty for this Walmart story, there are hundreds of different regional chains in Canada. It would actually surprise most people to actually see the list and to how each store actually differentiates in terms of the size of store and their different offerings. It's a much different landscape than you would see throughout the United States. And as for the largest grocery operators in Canada that are US owned, it's mainly just Costco and Walmart. And so you can see that there is a lot of opportunity for different investment, and Walmart is most likely looking at the fragmented retail grocery industry in Canada, again, with all of those different regional chains, along with the rather strong sales of Costco that they just put up in terms of Canadian comps there in their latest quarter, and eyeing an opportunity to boost its brand via a widened selection and a greater convenience offering. And convenience is really what this story is about, Trent, with Walmart, in that they're going to be injecting $175 million into its omni-channel infrastructure. And they've done a lot here in the US, and we've talked about it time and time again. A lot of times they've striked out, but what strikes us is that they are seemingly in a rush to help the Canadian market with their stores there, with a plan to refresh and remodel an additional 23 stores to create, and I quote, a seamless intersection between the online experience and in-store feel. And so, Trent, currently, Walmart grocery pickup is actually already slated to be in 73 stores, 73 more stores in 2018, giving them 165 total stores. But overall, $175 million, you have to think that Walmart sees something and they're doubling down.
Talking about convenience, Walmart Canada launched a sustainable online grocery delivery service in Metro Vancouver through FoodX Urban Delivery Incorporated, which is part of Sustainable Produce Urban Delivery Incorporated, also known as SPUD. So kind of a play on the acronym there. And that's one of Canada's largest online grocery companies. Now, Leighton did mention selection, and this doesn't necessarily mean more food variety in every store, but rather some focused genres of food depending on what area of each city they're in. For example, Supermarket News points out that a new supercenter in Burnaby, British Columbia, which has a large Asian influence in that particular area, that store features a large selection of East Asian food. Overall, the plan is to have generally more ethnic and organic items, organic foods taking hold in Canada just as we're seeing them take hold in the United States. And as we did a deeper dive into the story, we actually came across multiple sets of research done between 2014 and 2016 that described the retail grocery landscape in Canada as extremely similar to that of the US. Now, these studies looked at the amount of candy and sweets that were offered at the point of sale position and found that Canadians were basically just as unhealthy as Americans in terms of craving that quick fix, but also the overall product mix was very similar between the two countries. Studies did note, however, there are more niche options for those wanting a Whole Foods-like experience in Canada. As Leighton mentioned, the market is so much more fragmented north of the border. You have at least 3 main staples for healthier foods, whereas south of the border, you could make an argument for Sprouts and potentially Whole Foods, maybe half of Trader Joe's, that type of thing, but a few more options north of the border. Now, going all the way back to the beginning of the podcast, with our first story in Sears, we noted the lack of retailing basics with their aging fleet of stores. And with this story, we highlight now how basically a forward-looking retailer like Walmart can reinvest even with some of their relatively new stores. So it's not just leaving your stores to rot, it's looking at even your newer stores and wondering how you can do things better. One of the reasons that Walmart has become the giant that it has in terms of brick and mortar retail. Walmart's taking a close look at the space between their aisles as well as their signage. And according to management, Aisles are going to be a bit wider in some of the stores that they're redoing, some of these 23 stores, and signs are going to be more colorful in order to highlight the different subsections in the grocery space. And while lighting was not mentioned, we would not be surprised to see higher output fixtures and more energy efficient LEDs that Walmart has certainly invested in, not only in the United States, but also south of the border and in South America as well.
On the exterior of their stores, they are going to be doing what many of the stores in the U.S. have already been doing over the last 2 years, and things that we've marked on this podcast is interesting for sure. They're going to be making dedicated parking stalls for grocery pickup. These have orange painted signage and are the closest stalls to the actual physical building, with some U.S. locations actually having larger drive-through type infrastructure. It's unclear which they're going to utilize, but what's fairly clear is that it's going to be a constant process to innovate. So I would not be surprised if you see some drive-through infrastructure being built up and then taken down. It's a constant form of evolution here for Walmart. If you look at a quote from Walmart Canada's president, he says that this investment in our stores is part of our commitment to provide our customers with an improved in-store shopping experience. We are modernizing our stores, ensuring seamless omni-channel shopping experience and meeting evolving customer needs. And this really speaks to their, again, continued investment with Canadian stores. And I think this is going to be a positive for the Canadian customer, because not too long ago, I don't know if you remember on this podcast, we had talked about the divestment of Target stores in Canada. And we often wondered why, because Target stores in Canada, they weren't doing too horribly, but they wanted to really focus on U.S. operations. Walmart is doing the opposite, and they've done the opposite for quite some time with all of their international expansion. But you do see sort of a shift in their thinking. I think their focus right now is primarily on North American sales, because if you look at their balance sheet, if you look at their income statement, over the last 5 to 10 years, it really has shifted from we are only going to see growth internationally to, you know what, there's a lot of opportunity in the US, particularly with omnichannel. And I think that's exactly what Walmart's Canadian president is saying here.
As always, we may have a position in or against companies we discuss on the podcast. Do not invest in stocks solely on the input of the podcast hosts.
We've reached the final segment of the Retail Focus podcast, a segment we call Looking Ahead, where each Leighton and I talk about one retail story we're keeping an eye on over the next month or year. And we begin with Leighton.
So I just spoke about Walmart. We both just spoke about Walmart, and I'm going to speak about Walmart in my Looking Ahead story again. At this time, it's going to be a partnership with PayPal. We speak of partnerships a lot, but this PayPal partnership is, in my opinion, going to be a big one. So PayPal just announced that immediately customers can load their PayPal accounts with cash at stores, but then also in the coming weeks be able to make purchases for a nominal fee using their PayPal accounts for Walmart goods and services. So Walmart service desks, ATMs, and cash registers will all be able to use a PayPal form of payment. It's going to be a $3 fee though. So for those that maybe have other means of paying that don't want to use the $3 extra, I would suggest doing that. But this is going to be interesting because this is yet another way that customers are going to have a way of paying at the register for Walmart. And this is something we talked about with Costco with the Visa partnership. When they signed on with Visa and dropped American Express, we said that there are more Visa cardholders, and as a result, more people are going to be able to make more purchases. They're not going to be hamstrung by only having one or two forms of payment. And this is exactly the same thing. And this is what I have to say Walmart is ahead of the curve on and has been for some time, particularly with Sam's Club, because if you remember back 15, 20 years ago, you could only use a Discover card at Sam's Club, and now you could pretty much use any form of payment. The reason being is you're making it easier for your customers. So the net positive here is that more people have more access to total funds out there, and I think PayPal is really trying to take advantage of this. I think this is a win-win for both companies. Again, if you look at a statement, Senior Vice President of Walmart Services and Digital Acceleration, Daniel Eckhart, he said that Walmart is committed to expanding access to financial service products that are convenient, easy to use, and available every day for low prices. And I think this is interesting because he just said what I just said. It's going to be about convenience, but it's also going to be about getting that top line number up. So if you can form a relationship with PayPal, go ahead and do so. My biggest takeaway is, why did this not happen sooner? PayPal is a massive company. Shares of PayPal, as a result, were up 2.2% in early trading on Thursday. And as Trent remarked earlier in this podcast, in this very episode, the stock market's been up and down this week. It's very interesting. Shares of Walmart were flat. However, shareholders of PayPal really liking what they see here with this partnership.
We talked earlier in the podcast about how we hate to see retail stores close, and my looking ahead story is about a story that effectively came out a couple of months ago, in that Orchard Supply Hardware, or more accurately Lowe's, the parent company of Orchard Supply Hardware after they were acquired back in 2013, will be closing all OSH locations in California. There's 99 stores there. Now, like I said, that was announced back in August. It was one of Marvin Ellison's first announcements. But one thing that I'm interested in looking ahead to as these stores close, predicted to close by the end of the year or potentially on into January. As you look at these stores close, it does open up a gap in the California hardware market. You have Home Depot and Lowe's out there, but could there be another company that steps up into that gap to fill it? Orchard Supply Hardware, not known for having the massive store size that the likes of Lowe's and Home Depot have. In fact, one of Lowe's initiatives after acquiring Orchard Supply Hardware was to put more of their locations in urban centers. So my looking ahead story is about this. What will fill that gap? Will anything indeed fill that gap that Orchard Supply Hardware is leaving? Orchard Supply Hardware, a long existing company. They've existed now for 87 years. And again, Marvin Ellison said that perhaps the acquisition back in 2013 of Orchard Supply Hardware wasn't the best use of capital, but overall, they were still bringing in quite a few sales. They had $600 million in sales in 2017. That only accounted for around 1% of Lowe's overall revenue, but at the same time, that's $600 million in sales that is up for grabs. And it's in a burgeoning industry in the home improvement field where we've seen constant year-over-year growth in top-line revenue for both Home Depot and Lowe's. So who's going to step up and take that market share? Will anyone step up and take that market share? It could be a smaller company, for example, Ace or True Value or a cooperative. Who is going to step into that role that Californians have gotten so used to Orchard Supply taking care of for the last 87 years? Well, that'll do it for us here on the Retail Focus podcast. For Leighton, I'm Trent, saying so long until next week. Once again, a big thanks to our sponsors, AdRoll.com and Blinkist, and we'll be back 7 days from now.
This has been the Retail Focus podcast. For more, visit our website at retailfocuspodcast.com and subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher. Follow us on Twitter at Retail Podcast.